Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Jill Jolly, toku ingoa. Welcome to this webinar on the Science, Innovation and Technology Reforms. I'm Jill Jolly, the MB Chief Science Advisor, and I'll be emceeing this hui. Joining me today is the Minister of Science, Innovation and Technology, the Honourable Dr. Reti, Iain Cossar, Programme Director, Science System Reforms at MB, and Danette Olsen, General Manager, Science System Investment and Performance, also at MB. I'll open with the MB karakia. Ka whia tomana kia mau kia maia, ka huri taku aru ki te pai kahurangi, kei reira te oroanga moku, ma mahi tahi, ka ora, ka puawai, a mātou mahi katoa, ka pono, ka tika, tihei mauri ora. Welcome again to our presenters and to everyone online. The outline for today's webinar is that Minister Reti will start with some introductory remarks. Iain and Danette will outline the reforms announced yesterday, and then we'll open up for a Q&A session. Can you please use the Q&A button on your Teams window to submit questions? The webinar will be recorded, and if we don't manage to address all the questions, we'll group up themes for a future Science, Innovation and Technology Reforms newsletter. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Minister of Science, Innovation and Technology, Minister Honourable Dr. Reti, who is joining us from his office in the Beehive. I see it actually says you're Jeremy today, Minister, but we know it's really you. So welcome, and over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Ngā mihi tarangi, ngā mihi te whenua, ngā mihi kia koutou, kia ora mai tātou. Thank you, Jill, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Let me come back again. I just wanted to acknowledge all of you, as many of you being at the core of excellent science and research that's critical to our country's future. I want to thank you for your work and the passion that I have witnessed many times since taking on the Science, Innovation and Technology portfolio, which of course I also have responsibility for university statistics and Pacific peoples. Now, as you may have heard me say, this government is committed to creating a system where science is not only supported, but where it is central to building a stronger economy, greater resilience and better lives for all New Zealanders. Earlier this year, we announced the most significant reforms of our science, innovation and technology system in more than 3 decades. We are now moving swiftly to implement these changes so we can see more breakthroughs, more discoveries, more startups and many more opportunities for Kiwis to succeed on the world stage. Since 1 July, we have stood up 3 new public research organisations, the Bioeconomy Science Institute, Earth Sciences New Zealand, and the Institute for Public Health and Forensic Science. Work to establish the New Zealand Institute for Advanced Technology as our 4th public research organisation is well underway. Investments have been announced to accelerate artificial intelligence research and commercialisation and future materials and magnet technologies. In the past 6 months, I have announced $71 million for future materials and magnets, $70 million for artificial intelligence, $46 million for smart ideas, $183 million for major research programs, and recently a $42 million new biodiscovery platform. That's all in the past 6 months. To guide future funding strategy, a Prime Minister's Science, Innovation and Technology Advisory Council is in place to provide independent advice on long-term priorities for government-funded science and innovation in New Zealand. Yesterday, I also announced changes to the way science and research will be funded to make it easier for you to focus on delivering impactful science that benefits New Zealand. I have substantively accepted the recommendations of the Science Sector Advisory Group report, which encapsulated the message from our science and research community that the current funding system is too complex, too bureaucratic, and takes time and energy away from actual research. The structure and form of the funding system does not align with funding systems in other small advanced economies. Now, the changes we are making cuts red tape for researchers applying for funding and will simplify the way we make decisions so you can spend less time navigating complex funding structures and paperwork and more time on discovery and innovation. A single independent decision-making board known as Research Funding New Zealand will be operational, and administrative arm will replace multiple decision-making bodies while making sure experts are making decisions on where to award funding. Strategic advice from the Prime Minister's Science, Innovation and Technology Advisory Council will focus our funding on the areas with the greatest potential for impact: the economy, the environment, health and society, and technology. The government will continue to back a broad range of science, from blue sky foundational research through to applied and commercial innovation. But we will do so with a system that is simpler, more connected, and focused on impact. Humanities and social sciences will continue to be important. These reforms are about smarter investment and stronger outcomes for a better future, and align science funding with similar streamlined structures in other small advanced economies. These changes contribute to the creation of a more strategic science system that works for our scientists and supports our ambition to boost the economy, seize opportunities, and achieve greater impact for all. Reducing the 7 Crown research organisations to 4 public research organisations, merging NIWA and Met Service, and streamlining funding means less administration, which also means more money for science. Many have pointed to our relative OECD contribution to R&D and say we need more, and I want to say now, I agree. But having a modern structure to place any new funding has to be the first step. In conclusion, over the past few months, I have seen our scientists send high-temperature superconducting magnets to the International Space Station, the first time ever for high-temperature superconducting in space. I have announced funding for the Deep Heat project, in which global geothermal experts will explore the significant supercritical energy potential of the central Taupo volcanic zone. I have celebrated the launch of BioWave, a biofuel innovation spin-out that converts wood biomass to marine fuel, which offers a promising solution to reducing the shipping industry's carbon footprint. I have also enabled New Zealand's, and indeed the Southern Hemisphere's, newest and largest superconductor, and made sure that it produced its first weather forecast. These are just a few examples of the innovative science and research that is underway right now to shape New Zealand's future. And by way of example, and for your knowledge, the Bioeconomy Science Institute tell me they currently have 55 commercialisation projects in the pipeline. These breakthroughs are being delivered despite a system that wasn't well built for today's science. So let's move at pace to build that system, and then together, let's imagine what possible future we may have together. Thank you for everything you do. Kia ora mai tātou.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those opening remarks and setting out the vision for the future science innovation technology system. I think it's an exciting time, and you've outlined some amazing science that's currently going on at the moment. Now, we really appreciate your time and understand that you're a busy man, so we'll take you off screen, but feel free to hang around and listen on to the presentations as long as you can. So thank you again.
Kia pai tōra.
So next up is Iain Cossar, who's the Programme Director for the Science System Reforms at MBIE. Iain, the floor is yours.
Kia ora, thank you, Jill, and thank you, Minister. I'd like to kick off by echoing the Minister's thanks to you, all of you who have been involved in getting us to this point. Yesterday's announcements are the result of an extensive consultation, discussion and debate across universities, PROs, independent research organisations, government departments, critical sector groups and industry representatives over a long period. I'd particularly like to thank Sir Peter Gluckman and the Science System Advisory Group. This has been an enormous amount of work for the sector to achieve this milestone. As the Minister said, the science funding changes announced yesterday are part of a broader set of reform to the science system. The Prime Minister's Science, Innovation and Technology Advisory Council are meeting regularly and will be providing ministers with their advice on the strategic priorities for the system as a whole. Once those decisions are taken, ministers will be able to turn to a single funding decision maker to give effect to those priorities. That's the announcement made yesterday, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. The new public research organisations are up and running in their new forms, and we're already seeing the benefits of a stronger collaboration within and across those institutions. Mechanisms are being put in place to enable stronger connection and collaboration across the PRO and university systems, and work is well underway to establish the Institute for Advanced Technology, and the Minister mentioned a couple of investments that have already been announced. Callaghan Innovation is being disestablished, but with those key innovation functions transferring to other parts of the system. Yesterday's announcement outlines the new strategic approach to science funding. This will align public investment with national research priorities and establishes a new independent decision maker. Research Funding New Zealand is being set up as the primary funding decision maker with oversight across the system, replacing most existing decision makers. The board will have a range of functions, and Danette will speak to those shortly. The government has been very careful to ensure that Research Funding New Zealand is an independent decision maker. We know how important this is for ensuring the highest quality and highest potential science is awarded funding. Stress the independence of RFNZ. Just talk a little bit about how the strategic approach works. As you know, the Prime Minister's Science, Innovation, Technology Advisory Council was set up earlier this year. The Council is working through the advice for government on areas for greater investment and the areas in the absence of new funding, with those areas in the absence of new funding that would need to be deprioritised. This advice will inform a science investment plan to be developed in 2026. The Science Investment Plan sets out the strategic priorities and aligns public investment with long-term government goals. The final decision on the priorities and the Science Investment Plan will be made by the government. The system itself will shift to a pillar-based funding model. The new funding system organises itself around 4 pillars to give better transparency about the focus and impact of science and research and show greater alignment to government priorities. The pillars were focused around economy, environment, health and society, and technology. And while the exact names of those pillars may change, the framework endures. The funding mechanisms will be used flexibly to deliver on each pillar's priorities. That means contestable funds, mission-based funding, blue sky funding, investigator-led research can all be altered within each pillar to better reflect the priorities and outcomes sought within that pillar. As an example, RFNZ may decide that the environmental outcomes being sought are better given effect to through, for instance, longer-term stable or mission-orientated funding. But it may be that the challenges in health and society lend themselves to more basic research. RFNZ will have the flexibility to use the tools that they see as most appropriate to go after the outcomes and priorities being set. The pillars are outcome focused and specifically allow for transdisciplinary research. None of the changes being announced today move any money around the system, nor do any of the announcements being made reduce any funding in the system. As I said earlier, the prioritisation advice will come from the Prime Minister's Council, then will go to ministers for decisions, and then Research Funding New Zealand will give effect to those decisions. The system will align public investment in science with national research priorities. The science investment plans outline the what, the system-wide priorities and allocations. RFNZ then develops pillar investment plans, and these set out the how actions will deliver on the priorities set out in the pillars. Research Funding New Zealand, the new independent board, will advise on the pillar investment plans and how they will give effect to the science investment plan priorities. The new system has mechanisms as clearly it is very priority driven and has an independent decision maker to invest in those priorities. A larger, more resilient, collaborative PRO institutions are more enabled to give effect to those priorities, and a new Institute for Advanced Technology is being established to elevate the importance of those investments in the New Zealand science ecosystem. Government makes final decisions on research priorities within pillars, science investment plans and pillar plans, but it does not make the awarding decisions. Finally, I just want to repeat that these changes don't change the amount of money going into the system in any way, and all existing contracts will continue as normal. Thank you again for all your help to get to this point. It's a significant change, and we know there is still further work to be done. That work we hope to do in collaboration with yourselves.
Thank you, Ian. That was a fantastic overview of the new system and how it will work from the strategic level downwards. So now we're over to Danette, the General Manager, Science System Investment and Performance at MBIE. And over to you, Danette, to explain more about how it'll work.
Right. Thank you, Jill. So Research Funding New Zealand has been created as a new independent board, as Ian outlined. The board is going to replace the roles of the Science Board, the Marsden Fund Council, most of the decisions that MBIE makes regarding science investments, and in the future, the Health Research Council. So the goal of this is to make funding decisions more strategic, in line with those government level priorities, and focused on achieving the best outcomes for New Zealand. The Independent Board will have a few functions. They'll make funding decisions, they'll advise on the pillar investment plans, they'll ensure funding delivers on research priorities, they'll provide a broad portfolio view of funding invested across the pillars, and monitor and evaluate the performance and impact of investments. We're aiming to have Research Funding New Zealand set up early in 2026, and we've already begun the process to seek members for the board. Those roles are open now on MBIE's website, so I would encourage you or anyone you know who could contribute to the work of the board to have a look and potentially apply for those roles. That board will report to the Science, Innovation and Technology Minister, and there'll be 8 members, including the chair. Members of the board will provide a mix of research, academic, government and industry expertise with strong strategic and governance experience as well. The members will normally be on the board for a term of 3 years. MBIE's role is to be the Secretariat for Research Funding New Zealand, and that function will sit within the Science System Investment and Performance branch at MBIE. Once fully established, Research Funding New Zealand will be responsible for around 570 million per year. So this includes making decisions for the Endeavour Fund, the Marsden Fund, mission-led programs within the Strategic Science Investment Fund, He Ara Whakahihiko Capability Fund, and in the future, the Health Research Fund. They won't be making decisions on Horizon Europe and Catalyst. However, they will see where investments in Horizon Europe and Catalyst funds sit within the pillar framework, so they're able to take a strategic pillar-based view. We're still working through what their role might be in funding research infrastructure and institutions. So this does mean that existing decision-making boards will no longer operate, but there'll be a careful transition program phase to ensure continuity and to minimise disruption to the sector. We're really conscious that you'll be looking for certainty and clarity as quickly as possible. So we'll be looking to keep you and your leaders informed of changes and looking for ways to work with you as we work through the transition process. I really want to reiterate the comment that Iain made. Existing research contracts will continue. So if you've got a contract with us or the Health Research Council or the Marsden Fund, that will continue until the contract comes to an end. So what does this mean for health research? So the decision regarding health research is an in-principle decision. We still need to do quite a bit of work to examine the proposed changes and how they might be implemented. We need to work in partnership with the Ministry of Health, who of course have a strong interest in health research, and with the HRC, who operate under the Health Research Council Act 1990. To be able to bring health research into the remit of Research Funding New Zealand, we're going to have to look at legislative change. This decision, the in-principle decision, is dependent on a satisfactory plan outlining how the system will meet the existing statutory and operational functions of the HRC. And for this reason, some of these changes are going to take a few years to come into force. For the Royal Society, the administration of the Marsden Fund will ultimately move to MBIE, but however there'll be a transition process for 2026. So we expect that the Marsden Fund Council will kick off around later this year in the same way they have done in previous years. Go back on the slides. Same way they have in previous years. And then we will work through a process for how the Marsden Fund will transfer over to Research Funding New Zealand, who will become the decision maker. For the round in 2026, we expect that Marsden Fund Council will run the process right to the point of making recommendations for funding, but those recommendations will be made to Research Funding New Zealand, who will be the ultimate decision maker. Decisions have not yet been taken about who will manage out the Marsden contracts until they come to an end. That's something we'll work with the Royal Society on. And I just want to clarify that the Royal Society will continue to support Ta Whia Mana Research Fellowships, the Catalyst Seeding and the Prime Minister Science Prizes, and a few other bits and pieces that they are running for us, including CAUSE and Science Media Centre. So let's break down what this means for the funds, as I'm sure you're very interested in that. So as I said, they're going to assume responsibility for a number of funds. For Marsden 26, as I mentioned, we expect the Marsden Fund Council will run that process, but recommendations will be made to Research Funding New Zealand. And from 27, it will move to Research Funding New Zealand and MBIE to administer. For Endeavour 26, we've already invited existing contracts to seek a 1-year contract variation. We're working through that process. The final decisions for that will be made by the Science Board. For Endeavour 27, we'll be working through any changes that we might make to that process with Research Funding New Zealand once they're established. They'll have a really important role in ensuring that the processes that MBIE administers are the appropriate processes to make good funding decisions. Excuse me. Any changes to the funds within the HRC remains an operational decision for the HRC. As I mentioned before, there are no changes to the decision maker for the Catalyst Fund and for Horizon Europe. Some Catalyst funds are devolved to the Royal Society and to the Health Research Council, and they'll continue in that form. Funding decisions about any new Strategic Science Investment Fund platforms or reinvestments of existing platforms will be made by Research Funding New Zealand from 2026. So we have some of these in train at the moment. The final decisions for those will sit with the new decision maker. Decisions for He Ara Whakahihiko Capability Fund will also be made by Research Funding New Zealand. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot to work through. We're setting out the high-level direction today, but we're going to need your help to work with us to work through a smooth transition of these funds under these new funding decision makers. Thank you.
Thank you, Danette. A lot of detail there, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So as a quick reminder, if you have any questions, use the Q&A function at the top of your screen, hopefully on Teams. We've got quite a few that have already come in. So what we're going to do, we've got quite a bit of time. We're going to work through as many of those questions as we can. And I will kind of ask Iain and Danette to answer them. So let's start off with, I think this one's for Iain, but Danette might have some views as well. So comment is, we can now see all UAG and SSAG reports and understand the evidence and recommendations that are now being acted on. How will the outcomes of these reforms be judged? Who will be judging them? And how can we expect transparent reporting on what's been gained in addition to what's been lost? So it's a monitoring and evaluation of the reforms.
Well, that's a really good question. We haven't gone into the details of that here today, but improved monitoring and evaluation of the impact of the science we do is actually a critical part of these reforms. One of the functions of PIMSTAC is to opine upon the effect and impact of the system as a whole, its performance. So PIMSTAC or PIMSTAC, if you get the acronym right, we'll be looking across the system to see, is it achieving what it was that the government wanted it to achieve? RFNZ, supported by MBIE, will have a stronger role in ensuring that we are evaluating the impact of the science that we are funding.
Any further comments on that, Danette? Okay, cool. This next one's a long and interesting one. I'll read it all out, and maybe it's Iain again to kick off. So a simpler, more strategic system does sound appealing. However, this does carry trade-offs and risks. To what extent have the trade-offs of simplification been surfaced and weighed up, and how are the associated risks going to be mitigated? And I'll pause there. So trade-offs and risks.
Trade-offs and risks for simplification.
For simplification, yeah.
I think it might be more of a question for the simplification within the system sits at RFNZ and arguably the PRO mergers. We thought extensively around the PRO component and on balance decided that slightly larger and more resilient institutions would be stronger and more enduring for the system as a whole, better for it. Certainly with RFNZ, you have flexibility and maybe speed with more decision makers. I'm not sure that's actually true. But what you don't have is a mechanism to set a priority and give a single person a task to achieve it effectively. And that's what we're doing here. So PIMSTAC PIMSTAC advisors, ministers set priorities, and they have a single body that oversees pretty much all the funding and then pursues those priorities. We don't have that at the moment. If we want to make changes within the system, we have to make changes to and with 3 or 4 different funding bodies and potentially even change legislation to do it. If you're changing legislation, that's 2 years minimum.
Any further comments on that?
I think what I would add, I suppose, is that with the simplification of bringing the funds into one funding decision maker and one administrator supporting that, there's obviously a lot of opportunity to streamline processes, to make it simpler for the sector to engage, to have better coordination of funds. And one of the potential risks, however, is that, the HRC and the Royal Society have excellent capability around running the various investment processes that operate, and particularly Health Research Council with their expertise in the health sector. And so it's very important as we work through the transition that we ensure we retain that capability and that is brought into the decision-making process. So the details of all of this needs to be worked through, but I'm very conscious that we'll need to think through those transitions carefully, and MBIE will be working really closely with the Ministry of Health and HRC on the health side, and working closely with the Marsden Council and Royal Society regarding the Marsden Fund.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase this as part of the question, but it's goes a little bit deeper. So I think both of you mentioned the importance of transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary science. So how would you envisage that being considered within the new framework? Maybe I'll start with Danette for that one.
Yeah, I can do that. So as Iain outlined, the pillars are outcome focused. So research that will grow the economy, new technology businesses, improve the environmental outcomes, more cohesive, vibrant society, better health outcomes. In order to achieve those research outcomes, a whole range of research activity will need to take place. And so these aren't discipline-aligned pillars, they're outcome-focused. So transdisciplinary research that's going to deliver on those outcomes. In fact, transdisciplinary research will be required to deliver on those outcomes. And so we'll be seeking research activity to support that. And the mission-led strategic investments are the most likely place to support transdisciplinary multidisciplinary research in the system.
Thanks, Danette. A bit simpler question, this one. So it looks like each pillar is aligned with a PRO. Is that correct or not?
No.
Yeah.
No, that wasn't the intention. And I think those names are going to change as well. I wouldn't get wedded to them. It wasn't not our intention to align with PROs. And in fact, right off the top of my head, they're not actually aligned because environment sits across multiple PROs. Yeah. So no. Yeah. Definitely not. And the technology one does not mean New Zealand Institute of Advanced Tech either. It's an outcome, not an institution.
Yeah. Thank you. Next one, interesting question. Will there be any mechanism for science and industry stakeholders to influence the direction and decisions that the funding panel will make? So I'll go to Danette for that.
I think there's a couple of aspects to this. So we again need to work through the detail, but the development of the pillar investment plans, Research Funding New Zealand will need to consider who they talk to as they go through that process. Research Funding New Zealand will be able to establish panels and advisory groups in the formulation of those pillar plans. And so there is an opportunity for engagement with both the science research community and end users and industry. And then through the decision-making processes, again, panels can be assembled in order to assess proposals. And that I would expect that they would have the appropriate expertise depending on the investment, again, a balance between academic science research capability as well as industry end user interests. And then thirdly, our peer review processes generally seek the views of both researchers and industry in terms of the quality of research proposals and the potential impact. So I think there are different layers within the system that end users and industry can engage.
It's kind of a flip side question here to that one, and I'll flip this back to Iain. So why are researchers expected to subsidise businesses' R&D instead of incentivising businesses to hire our scientists?
Sorry?
So I think the point is, are we expecting businesses to basically, or government to subsidise business in their R&D?
Well, there's a long answer to that question. But government is funding, of the $1.1 billion passing through the SI&T system, that is taxpayer money, right? So that is paying scientists. So the economic principles around government and actually funding any science rest on market failures and basically risk. So governments will invest in public good science where there is no market, that there would be no one else, and it would be socially suboptimal not to have it. Then governments choose to invest tending to be low in the lower TRL levels at the science to de-risk activities whose payoff is so uncertain the private sector would not invest itself. And then in our system, we do have, well, in fact, most OECD countries do have a small subsidy, well, actually they're usually larger than New Zealand, to subsidise businesses to undertake research itself. So that's the research and development tax incentive. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I could just add, I mean, I think we do want industry to be employing scientists and building up their science capabilities. So the applied PhD, for example, is one mechanism that we've put in place to encourage the development of scientists who work within an industrial environment.
Yeah, and New Zealand industry is, prior to the CRI mergers, if you read the annual report of Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, they actually would have probably been about, I think from memory, about the third or fourth largest CRI, if they'd been a CRI.
Yeah.
So that there are, and I haven't even looked at Frontierers, for instance.
Yeah. I'll try and interpret this question. So I think what the person is asking is around the research funding New Zealand board, but it could equally apply perhaps to the PIMSATAC. So why is the stress on an international perspective person on the board? And why no Māori person strong in tikanga on the board?
Right, that might be a PIMSTAC question. So the Research Fund in New Zealand doesn't yet exist, of course. We are looking for people for Research Fund in New Zealand who can bring a range of expertise across the science and research system, and that would include Mātauranga Māori expertise. So that would be one of the capabilities that we would look for there. We would also look for international perspectives. So we want, for a couple of reasons, really. I mean, we don't, we need to be able to look at internationally, be able to compare ourselves internationally, and draw on international experiences of running excellent research funding processes and bringing in new perspectives. So having some internationals alongside some New Zealand members would be really helpful. And thirdly, just from a pragmatic point of view, it helps us manage conflicts of interest. So we're a small country and we all know each other.
Okay, this is maybe a slightly simpler question. So what specific funding mechanisms will support blue sky research?
Yep,
Danette,
that's the Marsden Fund. So we will continue to support Blue Skies research through the Marsden Fund. And the Marsden Fund, Blue Skies Research Fund, will sit underneath the pillar framework. And we still need to work through the details, but Blue Skies Research, like the Marsden Fund, is a discipline-based fund, and there is a way that we can run that process and then map over projects into the pillar framework so that Research Fund in New Zealand can see where decisions about basic research sits within that pillar framework. So that's our intention. To really want to acknowledge that the Marsden Fund has a strong brand internationally, is very well regarded, and we wouldn't want to dilute that brand.
So a little bit further along the value chain, so how do the reformed provisions support mechanisms and skills for scaling science into the wider deployment and commercialisation? That might be more of an Iain one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what I would say is that is a work in progress. There is the reforms don't end with today's announcements. In fact, there's an enormous amount of work to establish RFNZ and get the operating parameters for that organisation up and running, and the systems and procedures to make it as smooth and simple and fast as possible. Support for commercialisation and what other changes that might be needed to the system, things that I anticipate we'll be turning our minds to in 2026.
Just kind of running up my questions. So this is more around that investment balance across each of the four pillars. So will that be decided by the PIMSATAC or Research Funding New Zealand?
So the way the system will work is that PIMSATAC will advise ministers on the, if you like, the quantum in each pillar. The actual decision is made by ministers. PIMSATAC is an advisory board, a critically important part of the system, but advisory to ministers. Ministers take decisions on how much will go into each pillar. And then how the money is deployed within the pillar is actually taken, there'll be some advice both from PIMSATAC and RFNZ to ministers about how to deploy it within the pillar. And by which I mean contestable, mission, basic, investigator. Ministers will not be involved in the decision on who gets that money. Yeah.
Follow up to that question is, when should we expect that advice from the PIMSATEC to be announced?
First half of 26.
And then what is the expected cadence for such advice and possible changes in priority direction?
So I see this as a strategic planning function. PIMSATEC is the start of a strategic planning function. Science and science investment is long-term. It needs to be predictable. So I envisage that PIMSATEC will continue to meet annually, that their advice will become a little bit more granular, that they will actually provide advice on a whole range of other issues which they have not yet had an opportunity to turn their mind to. Infrastructure, for instance, what sort of science infrastructure we might need. System performance, they haven't even started thinking about how they might measure system performance. So I anticipate the cadence will be annual, but I'm not anticipating large shifts annually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, cool. Question about advanced technologies. So that sounds like a means to an end rather than an end in and of itself. What types of impacts are expected from the advanced technologies pillar that aren't already covered under the other 3 pillars?
I think the government's intention here is to call out some aspects of advanced technology and pursue them a little bit more vigorously than we have to date. If you look at New Zealand's expenditures, R&D expenditure, both public and private, we are well underweighted in advanced technologies relative to, say, OECD or most of the partners would compare ourselves with. So the intention here is to call out that focus.
Yeah. Interesting question. I think there's follows on from that one, is that the focus on AI is really welcome. But spending $10 million a year in a field where individual international companies are obviously spending tens of billions, what's the strategic thinking there in terms of how that investment might be targeted? Is it at specific niches, or what are you thinking?
So there is a contestable and public process about to begin, or has begun, on that, trying to draw out where such investment would have the biggest impact for New Zealand. We will not and have not ever been able to invest at the levels that our OECD partners would be able to do. The idea here is to try and be specific about where we think we have niche, where we think we have advantage, and then go after that, rather than try and go after all interests in AI.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, supported.
Yeah. You mentioned infrastructure funding earlier, and that might be something that the PIMSATEC turns its mind to in the future. How about what's the difference between that, institutional funding, and strategic funding? How are you thinking in those different areas?
Yeah, another really good question. We have yet to do the work to distinguish clearly between those types of funding mechanisms. That work will take place over the next 12 months. I think when I talk about infrastructure funding, what I'm thinking about is anecdotes, true or false, I don't know, that that PROs and universities are purchasing the same kit at the same time, and that there may be opportunities for us to actually buy, purchase, or secure in some way better scientific equipment to enable us to do the things we do if we were to do that collectively rather than individually. Also, we need I think we need a strategy around infrastructure. What is it we are going to invest in, and what are we not? Because again, we're just never going to be able to invest in everything that we would like to, I don't think.
Yeah. There's one for Danette on the HRC. So what's the timeline for switching over from HRC funding decisions to RFNZ? And will there be any changes to HRC funding amount and focus in the meantime?
Sure. So we could expect that the HRC will continue to operate as it currently is. As I said before, operational decisions are theirs about funding rounds and how they run those, but there's none of these changes impact on the amount of funding available. So this doesn't impact on the amount of funding that HRC receives in order to run the Health Research Fund and some of the other activities that they operate. The timeline is really dictated by the legislative program. Gosh, that's hard to say, legislative program, because in order for the health research funds to come to research funding in New Zealand, there actually needs to be a change to the Act or change legislation. So that could take anywhere up to 3 or 4 years. So it's a long run, and there'll be plenty of warning before anything changes, and we'll certainly be working very closely with HRC and the Ministry of Health. So I can't kind of be any more definitive than that right now. And as I mentioned when I gave my presentation, that this change is subject to being able to have a good transition plan and being able to identify where the current functions of the HRC would sit in the future.
There's a related question here around HRC ethics committees and where will the statutory functions sit.
So that's what I mean when I say the other functions. So the statutory, that still needs to be worked through. Absolutely.
Yeah. We will have them. They will.
Yes, we still have ethics.
Yeah. Be very, very clear.
Yeah.
But we haven't. That's something that we have not yet have an answer to.
Interesting question. Maybe this is for Iain. So where will the Centres of Research Excellence sit? Will they be inside or outside of the pillars?
They're currently outside the pillars. I think those contracts come up in 28.
Yes.
27, 28. I imagine the ministers might have a think about that at that time, but categorically they sit outside the pillars currently. Although PIMSTAG is cognizant of the investments being made in those.
And Research Funding New Zealand, when they're looking at their investments across a pillar, may look to see what is funded through the cause so that they can kind of take that into account when they're looking at what the pillar requires in order to deliver on outcomes.
But we've done no work to bring them in. That's not.
So question about the Royal Society. So comment is it's highly respected for the peer review process that has run for 25 years for investigator-led and blue sky funding like Marsden. So how will this process and knowledge, which are vital for a reputable funding assessment process, not be lost?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I acknowledge that the Royal Society has done a fantastic job. And I perhaps didn't say when we gave the presentation, is none of these changes at all reflect the quality of the people or the organisations that have been making decisions previously. This is about simplifying the system into a single decision maker and a single administrator. So yes, the Royal Society has excellent expertise in running peer review processes, and so that's part of the transition program, is to work through with the Royal Society how we might ensure that the appropriate capability and processes are transitioned to ensure that the Marsden Fund continues to have the reputation that it currently has.
Similarly with research funding, question here about its location within MBIE as a ministry. Comment is the mechanics of a ministry hinder some of what the minister says the purpose of moving to research funding New Zealand model is. Is the intention for MBIE to become the administrating arm of Research Funding New Zealand, or will an independent funding agency be established?
The intention is that MBIE will be the administrator. So Research Funding New Zealand will be an independent decision maker. MBIE's role will be simply to support them in that decision making. So running investment processes, receiving applications, getting them out for assessment. Research Funding New Zealand will determine at a high level what those processes will look like in partnership with MBIE, and then MBIE will run those. So that's a very independent process, much like, I suppose, the way the Royal Society supports the Marsden Fund. So they run a process, but the Marsden Fund makes the decision. So that would be the analogy.
We did give some thought to a separate Crown entity, but ultimately that dear ministers didn't want to go down that path for cost and simplicity reasons. It was just creating more institutions.
Yeah. Quick clarification question. Tawhia Tamana Fellowships administered by Royal Society. Yeah. It does say slides have incongruent information, so perhaps we can clarify that in our communications out. A general question, how will we ensure that the RFNZ will be inclusive in terms of gender balance, Pākehā versus Māori, scientific background of the members? That's maybe a Danette question.
Yeah. So the members and the chair of the Research Funding New Zealand will be appointed by Cabinet. So we are running an open process right now, seeking applications. We will put them through, much like a recruitment process, a shortlisting and interviewing process. We'll be looking to ensure we've got a good mix of capability and expertise and perspectives in that group will be putting those names through to the Minister, and then the Minister will take the names through to Cabinet, and ultimately Cabinet will make decisions. So we'll certainly be looking to have a balanced board.
Maybe this one's another Danette question around research funding available to universities, and we may not be able to answer it given where the portfolio sits. So are there differences in research funding opportunities available to universities compared to other tertiary education providers? And is there a policy in place to ensure equitable access to research funding for researchers based at tertiary institutions?
So from an MBIE perspective, in the funds that we administer, any tertiary education, well, any research organisation can apply for funding, whether they're a university, a wānanga, independent research organisation, a PRO, or even indeed a private sector research company. So one of our eligibility criteria is having science research capability. And so if you meet that, you're meeting that threshold. So I don't think that there are any barriers to applying for MBIE funding in that regard. I couldn't speak for the sorts of funding that tertiary education provides to universities or to wānanga and so on.
A question for Iain. So how will the research priorities of government departments and ministries, for example, MPI, DOC, MFE, Health, inform the investment strategies of the pillars?
Yeah. Well, I think they'll be able to do so at two levels. One is via PIMSTAC and then directly into RFNZ as well. Those research strategies are polished, they're available, they're well known. The third mechanism actually is just communication via MB, but PIMSTAC primarily, and then RFNZ.
Comment, again, this I think is Danette's. Can you comment on how the humanities and social science funding figures in this regime? Will there be panels within the pillars for humanities and social sciences? Or is the implication that projects be funded based on thematic focus rather than discipline?
Yeah, so the pillars are outcome focused, not discipline focused. And so for any research project, whether it's a contestable investigator-led project or the broader missions, will need to have the right capability to deliver on the outcomes that the person proposing that research or the team proposing that research to deliver. So that may include social science and humanities expertise. So in that sort of space, as I mentioned before, sort of multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research can take place. So you can imagine, for example, there might be something in the technology pillar that relates to risks or adoption of AI or linguistics expertise that might feed into AI development, that sort of thing. When it comes to the Marsden Fund, that is a discipline-based fund, and so we'll be putting panels together, much like the current Marsden Fund does, aligned to the investment plan for the fund. As people are aware, at the moment, humanities and social sciences aren't funded through the Marsden Fund.
All right, I think we've pretty much come to the end of our questions and the end of our time. So there may be still a number of questions that we haven't managed to get around to. And so, as I said at the beginning, unanswered questions will be noted and addressed in a forthcoming newsletter. So please register to get that newsletter on a regular basis. Only remains for me to thank all three speakers and everybody who has been online listening in, and for all your questions. I think there's going to be very insightful questions there, and we hope that we've managed to answer them to the best of our ability. So I shall finish with the MBIE karakia. Kahiki te tapu kia waitia ai te ara, kia turuki ai te ao marama, huye taike. Ngā mihi nui, thank you very much.